Today is January 22nd of 2024, and we welcome you to our Chapter 49 podcast. Chapter 49 represents most IRS employees in the state of Indiana. We thank you for joining us. I'm Larry Lannon, a volunteer, a retiree, and someone who deals with various aspects of communications for NTEU Chapter 49. And we have our chapter president with us as always, Duncan Giles. Welcome back, Duncan.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
And we're very happy to have a return visit from Dan Kaspar. He's with the NTEU National Office, Director of Field Operations and Organizing in Washington, D.C. Dan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Duncan.
So let's get started. Dan, I'd like to start off with something that just happened over the weekend. The New York Times, in its Sunday edition, featured an interview with the president of the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative think tank, which has published a lot about the civil service over the years, something that most federal employees in NTEU have reason to take issue with. But he was pretty direct in his interview with the Times, basically saying that once there is a new, at least the Heritage Foundation considers to be a conservative president, that the process will begin to basically dismantle the civil service as we know it. My question to you is, why should federal employees pay attention to this? Because I think they should. Tell me why you think federal employees should be concerned about something like this.
Yeah, that was a doozy of an interview. I didn't see the full interview, but I definitely saw some of the articles after that. Heard even in made it over to Davos. They discussed Schedule F, which is one of the biggest issues over in Davos recently. The Heritage Foundation has this playbook, with the point being they want to be ready in case someone gets in who is willing to enact some of their worst, possible dreams that they've, caught up. In the prior administration under Donald Trump, there was a lot of things that didn't come to fruition, often because they just weren't ready to get that stuff, rolled out. If they make a second run at it, or any other, president who is anti-federal employee, those things they're going to be ready to go, if not from day one, pretty soon thereafter. One of the biggest ones you've heard, Schedule F. It's not the best descriptor of what it is, but essentially was an executive order toward the end of the Trump administration that would have taken away adverse action rights, a lot of rights that federal employees enjoy for a certain number of employees. Lawyers and prognosticators and strategists might look at the actual language of the executive order and be able to piecemeal out what those positions would be. We don't think that's how they would do that if they were to enact something like that. There would be a much more just kind of throw them all into the basket approach there. Very, very concerning. So that's one of the biggest items, and NTEU is doing a lot to fight back against Schedule F. One of the things that we did was we petitioned OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, to adopt and to promulgate some regulations that would both give those employees under Schedule F those adverse action rights if they were formerly in the competitive service, but were moved to the accepted service. And also to put in a number of barriers that would, even if a Schedule F comes about, make it take much longer to actually implement and make them think about it this time instead of what they were about to do last time.
Dan, I won't tell this whole story again, but I've told the story many times what it was like for me in 1968 as a 16-year-old kid trying to get a driver's license in the state of Indiana. At that time, it was the spoils system, and we just changed parties in the governor's office. They'd fired the entire Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and they hired brand new people who were trying to figure out what to do. So if you want a federal government like that, that's where Schedule F comes in. And now, if you look at the BMV of today in Indiana, it is a civil service system, and the service is very good. Next question for Duncan Giles.
Well, first, I'd like to do a follow-up with Dan on this. I'm not sure that a lot of our listeners or viewers understand all the different things that NTEU National does. They see the local chapters. They may see an attorney for an arbitration or something like that. But Dan, can you talk a little bit about things like you're talking about working with OPM or filing a brief, friend of the court brief, or actual lawsuits with, be it a district court or Supreme Court. Just some of the things that NTU National does that people might not realize.
Sure. And those Schedule F regulations are an excellent example of that. And I should, clarify too. I mean, OPM, we've got to suggest something to them and they've got to sort of take that ball and run with it. And we make suggestions that they don't always adopt, but this one they felt was worthy. A similar one is, there's something called a higher graded duties, grievance, for instance. And higher graded duties, just in short, I could talk about this issue for a while. It's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. But this is when you have an employee who is, for instance, at a grade 7 level and maybe working the higher graded duties, at least 25% of the duties of a higher graded person at a grade 9. And there are many different ways that you can get that job through competitive procedures and contractual procedures. But sometimes you have the grade 9 who retires and that work gets dumped on the grade 7. And we've long had success in filing grievances and trying to get the back pay, the difference between that grade 7 and the grade 9 for that employee. Long story short, and for reasons that would take too long to sort of go through into the weeds here, about 2 decades ago, the Federal Labor Relations Authority had limited a remedy for that. So if someone was doing it for 4 years, they would only get the back pay for 120 days out of each of those 4 years. We've been fighting that through every possible way we can. And recently we convinced, through an excellent proposal put forward by our Office of General Counsel, OPM is they promulgated a rule and they're waiting on comments for that rule to correct that, so that the employees under that scenario would get full pay, for the full 365 days out of each of those years. So those are the things, as you said, Duncan, that, people may not see every day. We certainly put out messages about them, but we're working at all different levels to try to do that. Court cases as well. And sometimes there's not a legal or a regulatory solution to these. Developing relationships and trying to engage leaders at these agencies to do the right thing through persuasion is another thing that we do in concert with our chapter leaders and with feedback from our members.
Yeah, and I have to say, in my experience, NTU's done an excellent job of when they see a higher graded duty case, and you've won what we've won a number of these disputes with management. I remember one higher graded dispute I was involved with as a steward many years ago, and they just kept coming back to people, the labor relations specialist, one thing after another. Finally, they just gave up and said, "Okay, we have to do it." They just paid the money out. I want to move to the issue of the shutdown. We've delayed the shutdown until March. All right. It's still a 2-tiered system. IRS is the second part of that tier, but it's still a looming shutdown. I know you have a great legislative department. We've had Kata Saibenga on this podcast, and she does great work. And I know you communicate with her about what's happening. So there's a lot going on with the shutdown. Let me start off with where the shutdown situation stands now in your view, and in addition to that, the legal side issues that come up every time there is a looming shutdown.
Yes, I humbled myself after September 30th when I was telling anybody who would listen. I'm normally a pretty careful guy making predictions, but told everyone who would listen, this time there's going to be a shutdown. And Duncan, you raised your hand as well. I mean, the tea leaves were there in a way that they hadn't been for quite some time. And of course, we were fortunately wrong about that. So I've really tried to be careful with predictions. But what I will say is, as we've moved along here from CR continuing resolution to continuing resolution, and now we're just at the point where we're delaying it only really by a month to 5 or 6 weeks. I think at some point in time, they're going to fund, through the rest of the fiscal year here. There's, again, not getting in the weeds too far, there's some complications if you keep doing more CRs here from the debt ceiling deal that took place last year. There could be some catastrophic cuts that would automatically go into place. So, I'll leave it to Kata, to give the ins and outs, piece of that. But we're very fortunate that there hasn't been a shutdown yet. But every single time we do this, the agencies have to do their preparations. OPM and OMB, Office of Management and Budget, have to do their preparations. NTU, we continue to ramp up the chapters. But worst of all, for the members, the employees, they're having to face this fear every single time of the unknown and what's going to happen there. But there are three things. I think everyone is kind of getting used to unfortunately, getting used to some of the things you hear about. But there's just three things I want to mention very briefly today that we're sort of taking a look at and trying to work with OPM to make better in terms of their guidance. Really, two of them working with OPM and one of them we're doing internally. The two with OPM, one is outside employment issues. Whenever a shutdown gets past a certain time, people start thinking about, who are furloughed, start thinking about outside employment. Thankfully, NTU sponsored legislation made it through and people are now guaranteed to get paid, but that doesn't help you, if you're out for, God forbid, another 35-day government shutdown, for instance. So people start looking at outside employment issues, but there's things like some people don't have outside employment agreements in place, for instance, because they're not anticipating needing those. And during a shutdown, often there's not the requisite personnel to take in a new application for outside employment, either. So that we're trying to figure out a way to work with some of our agencies up front and to make sure that they have folks, on the ground in place who can take those things in. And we're also encouraging employees too to take a look at possibly putting in an outside employment agreement, a just in case, agreement. So there's that aspect that we're looking at. We're also looking at trying to make the unemployment compensation aspects a little bit easier. 50 different states and a lot of issues there as well. So we're working with OPM to get better guidance there. Just the last thing. Oh, Larry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go right ahead. Finish up. I just have one follow-up when you're done.
Absolutely. Yeah. The last item was just, we filed a lawsuit during that 35-day government shutdown. And that lawsuit concerned what's called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is what essentially says agencies, you can't pay employees during a shutdown unless they are exempt, for some reason or another. And what we argued, and you argued in that lawsuit, is that actually this Anti-Deficiency Act, which says you can force certain people to work but not be paid during the shutdown, is itself unconstitutional. It's easy, and the pressure is taken off of Congress during shutdowns because the accepted personnel continue to work during this time. And so our argument was they actually should not be allowed to work during that time because the Constitution says you can't take in any contracts and pay anyone at all. So this Anti-Deficiency Act that accepts that, it shouldn't be there in the first place. It's unconstitutional. The point being, we would try to force Congress to actually, fund the government as it should do from the first instance.
That was a very good summation of how NTU's worked very hard in this shutdown situation. As a veteran of many shutdowns back to the 80s, I will tell you that law that guarantees federal employees will be paid at the end of a shutdown, that guarantee wasn't there early on. And we didn't, as federal employees, didn't have any guarantee we'd be paid after a shutdown. So that was no small thing. And NTE was instrumental in getting that done. Wanted to give you and your staff credit for getting that done. And Duncan, you have the next question.
Yep. And now we come to the fun part. We're in the latter stages of the midterm bargaining where, both sides were able to open up some articles. And, NTU's interest was in expanding telework, especially where you could be when you did telework, as well as increasing award amount percentages, which is near and dear to almost all of our employees' hearts, the two issues. And IRS has been banging the drum on rent reduction and, wanting to increase hoteling / desk sharing for a lot of folks out there. So just wondered what you might be able to do to give us some sort of update as to where we are in that process now.
Absolutely. And you hit some of the high points of, what the articles that NTU opened and what we're fighting for, the increasing of awards and the various ways that we can recognize all of these employees who are just doing incredible work every day under strained circumstances. Increasing telework, just, continuing to make work lives better, expand the area in which you can telework. have a remote work pilot going on, as well, all of those things. The space issues is something that I would like to expound on just a little bit. And I've got a few facts and figures that I think you'll find interesting that I was reviewing this morning. So, the IRS has an interest, which we've never fully understood, but they have an interest in reducing their space, but to do it in a way that requires hoteling or desk sharing much earlier than what we believe would be necessary. And so, many chapters and many posts of duty across the country have received, chapters have received notices saying, we would like to start desk sharing in your POD. And they're in a hurry to do it often when these notices come out. And the stated purpose is that they're planning on bringing in a lot of folks through hiring, which is great. We support that, and we're trying to help them, do that and be better and get that done as quickly as possible. But what we've learned there throughout bargaining is there are about 530 facilities at the IRS with about 36,000 vacant workstations. And, right now, those workstations and where they're hiring doesn't perfectly, match up. But what we keep telling them in every way that we possibly can is you're trying to do this way too early, such that you would have desk sharing and all these empty desks because it's well before you can bring in hiring. So just a couple more very quick facts and figures. We get data from the IRS, the NTEU does, and we get 2 weeks out the number of employees who they expect to onboard. And on average, and this varies widely, but on average, over the last 2 fiscal years, IRS seeks to bring on 1,541 employees each pay period. And then the day of that enter on duty, which is 2 weeks later, by that time, they're only expecting about 950 employees. And then we receive data 2 days later as to who they actually onboard, 592 employees on average. So when we hear you need to hurry up and get this desk sharing, done, we tell them, no, you folks are having trouble bringing on the numbers who you're using these predictions for months and months in advance. When you're that far off 2 weeks out, imagine how far you off before then as well. So that's some of the headbutting that's going on in negotiations. Our regular sessions of negotiations have come to an end with some progress made, but then we now have a fact finder who's coming in, and we start this process at this point.
Let me follow
Gotcha.
up. Go ahead, Duncan.
Yeah, I was going to say just to back up exactly what you're saying. 2 points. First off, when you point out to them that actually I have 3, you point out to them, well, why don't you hire in the places where you have a ton of space? That way, employees are happier. You don't have to do that, and you can do the rent reduction as you slowly. Nope, don't want to do that. Secondly, is why in the world would you, if you have all these empty desks and you have not come up with a project yet to do a rent reduction, would you make folks desk share when there's empty desks right next to them? Is nuts. And the third one, and one of my favorite examples lately, is we've got a post of duty that is closing down by this summer. That is literally going to be shut down. The employees are going to be absorbed into another post of duty in the commuting area. And they continue up until and including this pay period, hiring more employees in that post of duty that's closing down. And you can't make them understand why. And I'm talking to executives going, why are you putting people there when they're going to have to move in 6 months? Well, it's still open. So, I totally get you when you're talking about trying to convince them with facts and figures. It's not fun.
Dan, if I could follow up a little bit on what Duncan just said, because one thing Duncan has said several times on this podcast in recent weeks is that part of the problem here is that the IRS cannot speak to each other. You have one part of the IRS that says we're going to hire, another part that says, well, it's trying to deal with the space, and there's no guarantee there'll be space for these people. So I think sometimes NTEU is the only institution that crosses these borders within the IRS. And sometimes Duncan has to say, have you actually thought about what, have you talked to the other part of IRS that's supposed to provide the space? Or no, we really haven't. And so, Dan, I guess the question is, uh, NTU, I think the point NTU is trying to make it, and I'm emphasizing a point you just made, is that your facts don't add up. And why don't you talk to each other and figure out space based on what your business operating divisions are saying they want to hire? Any comments on that?
Yes, I mean, been with NTU now for about 13 years and, was involved working with a number of chapters on space negotiations years ago. And it's been different, certainly. Now, of course, they're with extra telework and there is more space, they're trying to do more of it. But back then, when I think we had a little bit more time to develop it, you bring in the business operating divisions, you bring those BODs in, and there was much better discussion across the BODs and with FMSS, which was REFM, at that point. And now there is often a disconnect, a noticeable disconnect between what FMSS is trying to get done and what the BODs are trying to get done. And candidly, we attempt, we're working with the BODs as much as we possibly can because they get it and we get it sometimes. And frankly, FMSS may not always understand what's going on there. So excellent points from both of you on that.
Yeah,
and a lot of times, I'm sorry, and a lot of times FMSS isn't even informed. I always love it when I sit there and say, oh yeah, by the way, do you know that this is happening or this is happening? Nope, they have no idea. They never talk to us. And it just makes me want to pound my head against the desk and go, what is going on?
Yeah, history lesson. I'm sorry. I'm going back to the old days. The days we had district directors, this didn't happen. They knocked heads and got it done. Now we have these stovepipes to operating divisions that kind of operate independently, and there's nobody sometimes in the organization to settle the difference. So I think IRS has some systemic issues to deal with, but that's just my editorial comment.
Yes. Larry,
I,
just real quick, last thing I was
sure.
just going to just mention is, we have a number of members, who are on the front lines in FMSS, and, they often get pulled in various directions. They know what to do. They know the best way to make this work as well. And frankly, if management would listen to them a bit more, some of these disconnects wouldn't be there.
Oh, and my first job at IRS was in the supply room, believe it or
Oh,
not.
okay.
The old REFM.
Yeah.
I was, so I knew that whole organization is not recognizable today to what it was then. And I think it functioned better in those days, but maybe I'm a bit prejudiced. Dan, I've got a question for you that deals with telework.
Mhm.
And the reason I'm asking this question is that the White House has been sending pretty strong messages to the cabinet members that the administration wants employees back into the office. Now, at IRS, you have to be in the office at least 2 days every pay period. So there is a requirement to be in the office. But we've had field people for ages who weren't in the office a lot anyway. And that's where the old FlexiPlace started, which morphed into our now telework program. Has the White House edicts that are going down to the agencies had any impact on the telework program as far as IRS employees are concerned?
As far as IRS employees are concerned, not so much. We haven't really seen that come into negotiations over Article 50 all that much yet. There's also a remote work pilot, which is out there, too. And remote work as distinguished from telework, where remote work, your post of duty ends up actually being your home, at least for the duration of the pilot. So we haven't seen it that much with the IRS yet, but I will say that we have seen it in other places where, we're doing term negotiations there on telework. And for agencies that are not forward thinking, that hadn't really learned many of the lessons from the pandemic, they took some of that language and they're trying to use that to drive home, and decrease the telework at negotiations. I got to call out the FDIC, specifically, which had gone to a place where they were looking for folks to come back 3 times a week. And, we've seen 2 or 3 decisions that have come at the Federal Service Impasses panel where we've reached an impasse on negotiations. And there's been some helpful language in there where the impasses panel said, look, even though the White House OMB memo talked about wanting to have more in-person, interaction, that does not, absolve the agencies from making the arguments that you've got to make in bargaining, as to why that they feel that that is necessary. And so the proverbial water cooler talk and the other airy things that, you hear sometimes there, that has not worked well with the panel at all. So we've been able to fight some of those proposals back.
Duncan, any final comment for Dan?
Well, I just want to follow up real quick on what you just said. One of the things when we were negotiating the last agreement was they wanted more people in the office to have those collegial discussions and talk about and things of that nature. But as I told them, that was 20 years ago. That hasn't happened in the past 20 years. So whatever you're doing on telework to try and bring folks back into the office, that's not going to happen. The last thing is, Dan, is there anything that you'd want to bring up that we haven't talked about that you think that needs to be touched on?
I think the only other thing that I want to mention is with respect to the IRS, there's this IRA funding, that's been out there that has allowed the IRS to hire in numbers that it hadn't been able to do in quite some time. And the IRS is getting better, with NTEU persuasion and assistance in onboarding folks better. They recognized from the commissioner on down that they needed to get better about recruiting and retaining. I say better because there's still ways to go there.
Yeah.
But this IRA funding is designed to get the IRS back to a place where it should have been, but for the last 13, 14 years of starving it of resources, where employees have just been overworked and, the IRS can't deliver on its mission in the way that the American public deserve and that those employees deserve to be able to do as well, because they just didn't have the resources. It's only begun to start to get better. This is a long-term thing, but we are really, really concentrated on making sure that that funding stays in place so that the IRS can continue to do what it needs to do to get itself back up, to help taxpayers meet their obligations and to help the employees be able to do their jobs without being so stressed out and being overworked. So that's a huge, huge thing that we're worried about, this year and that we're driving towards. So I think that's sort of the other thing I wanted to make sure I just mentioned.
I love having Dan Kaspar on this podcast because every time you're here, we learn something new, and you've certainly done that today. As the Director of Field Operations and Organizing, would it be safe to say you're the top attorney at IRS or at NTEU working with IRS and all these other agencies?
One of them. I'm fortunate enough to oversee 70 plus just excellent dedicated employees at NTEU who care about what they do. They work with the chapters, they work with the members, and just live and breathe this stuff. We also have, just mentioning attorneys, I never want to call myself the top attorney here either, because we've got the Office of General Counsel, Kata Sabenga as an attorney, Ken Moffitt, Director of Negotiations. So we've got fantastic, folks here. And under Doreen's, leadership, former, chapter president of Chapter 1 and longtime IRS employee, our executive vice president, Anand Muni, too. They have they brought in some exciting propositions and things to work with here to strengthen NTEU. And we work together collaboratively and as a family. And we just love this job, and we love the folks who we work for, which is the members.
Well, yes, and I would have to say that after having worked for IRS for 28 years, many of those years as a union official, you talk to other people and other federal agencies, and what you find is that NTEU has always had a reputation for having the top legal staff when it comes to federal unions, federal representation. So I think, you when you talk about that legal staff up and down the line, you supervise a lot of the field operations, and that's where a lot of the rubber meets the road in terms of helping the individual chapters and members with with specific issues, arbitrations, and those kind of things.
Yes.
But out of time, Duncan, any quick comment or question for Dan before we go?
Nope, I think he has done an outstanding job and really explained a lot of things and hopefully give a good info for our members.
Dan, thank you for taking the time. I think that's the most important gift you can give us. I'm sure your time is valuable, and we appreciate you coming on to the podcast and talking to us. This is the Chapter 49 podcast. We thank you for watching and listening. If all goes well, Duncan and I will be back next week. Again, we thank Dan Kaspar and the NTEU National Office. In the meantime, please be safe and be kind.